Hello, and welcome to part 2 of our 4-part series on emblem and logo creation in Blender. Hopefully you've already watched the first part, which covered basic introduction, basic navigation, and manipulation in Blender, especially in the object mode. This is part 2, which will cover basic modeling, which will cover the edit mode and mesh creation. Okay, so now, instead of just dealing with objects in this view and just kind of moving them basically and scaling them, rotating them, things like that, we're actually going to get into the mesh level detail and start editing meshes. But before we do that, we're going to talk about primitive shapes, okay? What are primitive shapes? Well, usually when you make your custom meshes in Blender, you want to make your own kind of thing. It's very specific and precise. But everything's usually going to start with a primitive shape. It's easier just to add a cube and then build something that's roughly cube-shaped off of that. Or conversely, add a circle and build something roughly circular or cylindrical off of that. So, what Blender has over here, if you hit Create in the upper left, it has a list of primitive meshes that can be created in the 3D viewport. This is obviously a cube, but we can also create a plane, scale it up to actually show you it because it was inside the cube. We can create circles. Again, you know what, let's hide this cube. Oh, the plane's still there too. All right, we can create circles and manipulate those with everything we learned last time. And we can create cylinders. We can create all sorts of primitive shapes. We can even create a torus, which I've honestly never actually used. In all the modeling I've done, I've always made something roughly this shape in a different way. But it's there. So anyway, if you haven't noticed already, you can delete objects that are already created in the object mode by selecting them with right click and then hitting X and then clicking delete. And it gives you a little prompt. So it's like, are you sure? Yes. So you don't do that accidentally. Anyway, this allows us to get rid of the cube, make another cube if we wanted to, make a circle, make a cylinder, any kind of primitive shape like that. And then, as we stated before in part 1, when you have this, you can scale it in certain ways and manipulate it, rotate it, anything you want to make a wide selection of very basic shapes. So, now that we've kind of selected a primitive, which we're going to just stay with the cube for now, but we created our little primitive cube, but now we want to actually edit the mesh. We want to change this cube fundamentally. We don't want to just make it bigger or smaller or rotate it or move it. We want to actually change the mesh. That's where we get into edit mode. So, edit mode is the mode of Blender where you can actually change the mesh. Object mode is where you're kind of manipulating the whole object as one. Mesh mode is where you're editing the individual vertices that make up the mesh of the object. So we're going to create a primitive cube again to start fresh from new. Scale's 1, 1, right? No messed up scale, I promise. So we're going to hit tab and go into edit mode. Now before we start actually moving or doing anything, let's talk about the components that we can see in edit mode. You can see these little dots here. These are called vertices, okay? So obviously, a primitive cube is made up of 8 vertices, one for each corner of the cube. And a vertice is like the most fundamental element of a mesh. Any kind of complex curved surface is just made up of a series of vertices attached to one another. However, in Blender, you can select different elements in a hierarchy. So you can get vertices just like this, and when you're selecting with right click, just like we were in the object mode. So I can right click on an individual vertice to select it. However, if I come down here, I can switch to edges. Now in edges, I can right click the edges and select them. I can also change to faces and select faces. You'll notice when we switch to faces, each face gets labeled with a little dot on the side. This is an easy way for you to just click the dot and know what face you're selecting there. And there's reasons to pick all of this, and sometimes it's kind of weird, right? Because if I select these 4 vertices, I'm basically selecting a face. It's basically the same thing. But being able to switch between them allows you to quickly edit certain things in easier ways. So it's important to regularly you'll end up regularly switching between them for convenience as you're editing your meshes. So if you want to select all of the vertices, you can just press A. See, you might be confused because I deselected everything first. If you have anything selected at all, pressing A once will deselect everything, but pressing A again will select everything in the mesh. So that's a very quick way to just select the whole mesh at once using A. Now, as I stated before, right-click will select individual vertices. If you hold down Shift and right-click, you can select multiple vertices. And if you hold down Control and right-click, what you'll actually be doing is selecting vertices in a chain. So it's kind of hard to see from a cube, which let's go ahead and get rid of this cube. Let's make a circle. All right, and go into edit mode. We can see this circle is just a series of vertices arranged in a fixed radius from a central point. It's the definition of a circle. Go look it up. But anyway, if you hold down Control and hit another vertex, you'll see that it selects all the vertices in a chain to get to that vertex. And you can do that like that. Furthermore, you can combine these hotkeys in different ways. So I can hit up here and use Control to select that chain of vertices, but then I can use Shift here and then hit Control again to select these. And it kind of remembers where you were last. It doesn't, when I do the Control a second time, it uses this white highlighted vertex, which is my last selected vertex, and not this whole thing. So it's not like in Windows Explorer when you hold down Shift and it has to pick everything in between regardless of what you picked before. It's a little bit more intelligent than that. It's really convenient. So there's other ways to select vertices other than just clicking on them. You can also hit C to brush select, and I can use the scroll wheel to make this brush bigger or smaller. And when I left click and drag it, whatever it intersects or whatever it moves over gets selected. Furthermore, if I hold down middle mouse button, I can deselect, right? Which, by the way, if you want to deselect and you're not using brush select, all you have to do is click again, okay? So for example, if I had all these and I didn't want this vertex selected, I can hold Shift and right click it again, and it will deselect. And you can always easily tell what vertices are and are not selected, because the ones that are selected have this this like orange highlight to them, and furthermore they do this thing where it fades along the edge, which is nice. It shows you where they are. Anyway, other than brush select, remember C is brush select, right? You can also border select with B. Now if I press B, I can drag this kind of square and select them that way. And again, if I hold down middle mouse, I have to press B first. B and then middle mouse, I'll deselect whatever the border intersects with. Okay? Now, just briefly, you can do the same applies with edges. So now that I've switched it to edge mode, anytime this brush intersects some edges, it'll pick them. I can Control select with the edges, Shift select with the edges. All the same stuff. Let's see, let's delete this circle and get back to the cube. Go back into edit mode. And again, if I hold down Control, you can see it picks a path there. If I use the brush select, it does that. So those are the basic ways to select mesh geometry, whether it's a face, an edge, or vertices, a vertex, I should say. That's how you do it in the easiest way possible. So now that we know how to do all this stuff, let's finally get to creating our emblem. All right. Now emblems are usually circular, so that should be a good hint that we don't want to start with a cube. We want to kind of start with a circle. So I'm gonna press 7, and I'm gonna get an overhead top-down view, which is kind of my favorite view. I'm sure a lot of guys spend most of their time in the top-down. We're gonna create a circle. Now, down here in our little operator panel, you notice that once we've created this primitive, we can actually change some key properties about it. This circle is made up of 32 vertices, and I can change that. I can actually make this more or less. If I double the amount of vertices, you can see the circle actually gets a little bit smoother along the outsides. If I half the amount of vertices, let's just say 16, you can see it definitely becomes more of a polygon, right? It's got harder corners on it. Now, this is an important concept to think of because I'll just give you an example. When I was first learning how to do Blender, like in the very, very beginning, I was like, well, how do I make like a hexagon or something, right? Like I want to make like a stop sign. I can make circles, I can make cubes, but I can't make like a stop sign. How do I do that? Is there a way I can make like other polygons? Well, think about this. What is an octagon but just a circle that only has 8 sides, right? So in that way, I know that's like a real basic concept. Some of you are probably thinking, well, duh, you idiot. But that's kind of a key theme in doing 3D editing, is thinking about how a complex object is actually just a simple object, and how to make it how to make that transition easiest for you. So the easiest way to make an octagon is just to make a circle that only has 8 vertices in it, right? So for now, we want an actual circle. So we're going to crank this back up to 32, which is the default. The other settings here are not super important because they can, at least in my opinion, because they can all be easily edited in the 3D. They don't really need to be edited as inherent properties of the circle. But that vertices option, you'll end up using that a lot. So anyway, we've created a circle. Once we manipulate the circle or go into edit mode, these options will disappear. So you can only really edit these when you first bring in that primitive object. So make your choice at the beginning. If you screw it up, delete it, put in another one with the properties that you want. All right. So now that we have a circle, let's hit tab to go into edit mode. And now let's switch on our vertices so we can see more of like a granular thing here. Now, you'll notice in the emblem that I used as an example that there was kind of like a part that came out of the top and bottom, right? Because I wanted to have text along the top. I didn't want to just have a straight circular emblem like a perfect coin. I wanted to have text along the top and bottom, which is good because, you know, it's usually like your unit designation or something like that. So what we want to do to bring out that part is we want to kind of select the vertices at the top and bottom, and we want to kind of bring them up, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's select these vertices right here, and let's hit G and then Y to bring them up. Now, you're probably noticing something right away. Like, well, that looks kind of dumb. You kind of just have this weird weird slope here, right? And that's what we don't want. But that's how we do like a basic manipulation. See, we can move it any way we want, but remember, we talked about constraints before, and constraints are really important. They're really good for helping you out. So if you want to just bring it straight up, you would use something like this. But that's not what we want. We want to take this selection here and actually create a sharp corner here. We want to bring this physically out as like a new section of the circle. We don't want to just move this section of the circle. We want to create a new one. What we want to do is use extrusion, okay? Now, if I hit E with these selected, if I hit E, I can bring out an extrusion from this. Now, for some people who might not be familiar with the word extrusion, it's hard to explain, but it's basically like those old school Play-Doh toys that you had, where you would put a piece of Play-Doh in and you would squeeze down the handle and like it would have a star cut into it, and you would create a really long tube of star shape, right? That's literally extrusion. You're taking one shape and kind of stretching it out along one axis. So you're creating like an elongated version of it. That's what extrusion is. And extrusion is one of the fundamentally most important ways to manipulate meshes. So what we've done here is we've selected these vertices, or these edges, however you want to think about it, and we're just stretching them out. We're taking them one way or the other. And if we were doing it right, obviously, we would hit E and then Y to constrain it to perfectly along the Y-axis, and then bring it out like this, right? Now, this looks a lot better than what we had before when we were just moving the circle around. However, it still doesn't look quite right? Because this kind of is just like some kind of thing jutting out from the top, but we want it to be like an extension of the circle. What does that mean exactly? We want it to have the same center as the circle. You can see this curve, since we just moved it up, the center of that curve is somewhere around here. We want it to have the same curve because that's pleasing, right? That's like a real emblem. It's aesthetically pleasing. How would we do that? Well, we would combine extrusion with scaling, all right? So we would hit E and then S, and then it would do this. Now this is oh, you're going backwards now. This looks dumb, right? You're right, but we can fix this, right? But let's quickly talk about why this is wrong. Why is it making this really weird shape? The reason it's making this really weird shape is because we are scaling from the median of these points. The median is right here of these specific points. You can see we're scaling away from that. We don't want to do that in this particular instance. In most instances, scaling from the median is totally fine. But in this instance, we do not want to do that. What we want to do is we want to scale from the center of this circle. So how do we do that? Well, we undo that. And then we go down here to our header, which has a lot of useful features, remember? This little button right here is your pivot center for rotation and scaling. And right now, you can see it's set on median point. Instead, let's set it to 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is already set by default at the center of this circle. And we haven't moved anything around, so we can just keep it there. If we did have to move it around, I showed you how to do that in part 1. All right? So now that we've changed our scaling center to the center of the circle, if we hit E and then S again, now it comes straight out. And it maintains the same center of the circle. Let's bring it out something like that. Now, this is what we want. This is aesthetically pleasing, but maybe we want to have text at the top and the bottom. So let's select these bottom guys too, hit E and then S, and then bring them straight out like that. Okay, let's say something like that. Now, you'll notice that we've created planes here because these are filled in, right? You can create planes in the center. Let's select this whole circle and then hit F. And now we've created a plane in the center of the circle. Because we started with a primitive circle, there was no plane. It was literally just a circle. But we can just easily create that plane ourselves. Now, you can see we're already off to a cracking start here, right? This is the foundation of an emblem. All right, it's a flat little plane, and we don't want it to be a flat plane forever, though. So what can we do to make it 3D? You can probably answer that yourself. Extrusion, right? We just talked about it. So if we switch to face, if we go back to edit mode, we use faces, select all the faces, which I'm selecting them individually, which is dumb. I could just hit A to select all of them, right? Now we hit E, and you'll notice before we do anything, before we move the mouse, you'll notice that by pressing E, we've created a Z axis, as if we've made a constraint. That's because, by default, what extrusion will do, it will default to the normal of whatever you're extruding. Now, normal is a term that basically just means tangent. So for this flat plane, the normal is the Z-axis because this plane is created in the X and Y axis. So the normal to it is the perpendicular one, which is the Z-axis. So by default, when you use extrusion on a flat plane, it'll just default to extruding along the normal, which happens to be Z in this case. So we can just bring it up, make it whatever thickness we want it to be. Let's say something like that, right? Then if we hit tab to go back into object mode, we've created a 3D object. Congratulations. It's 3D for realsies, right? This is the foundation of our emblem right here. It's going to be a circle with some interesting symbols and whatnot in the center, some text along top, and some text along the bottom. All right. So now that we've created our kind of like the backing for our emblem, in fact, on that note, to keep everything organized and as a good habit to start early, let's go over to our organizer up here, our outliner, I should say, and let's rename this. Right now, you can see since we spawned this in as a primitive circle, by default, Blender named it circle. If you made another one, well, let's do that right now just to show you. If you made another circle, it would just call it circle 001, so on and so forth. Okay? That'll be really hard to keep track of if we just keep everything with their primitive names. Everything will be circle 1, circle 2, cube 1, cube 2. So let's double click on this and name it emblem backing, or whatever you want to name it. It doesn't matter to me, but it's important to keep naming stuff regularly as you go so it doesn't get too confusing, because believe me, that object that I showed you in the beginning of part 1, the emblem that I made, there is a lot of objects, probably like 20 or 30 in the whole outliner list. So it's important to name them properly to keep track of them. On that same note, if you get really busy with a bunch of objects, you can toggle their visibility with the eyeball here. The eyeball will toggle the visibility in the viewport on and off, and the camera will toggle the visibility in the final render. We'll talk more about that later because that's real dangerous, because what it does is it means that when you hit that render button, what comes out might be different from what you're actually seeing on your screen. So for now, don't mess with that, but the eyeball allows you to toggle visibility on and off. If this camera was getting in the way for whatever reason, the lamp was getting in the way, I could just turn them both off. In fact, I will for right now. No reason to have them on there. All right, let's continue with basic mesh creation. Let's create something to go on this backing, something easy. Let's say a sword, okay? Swords are, everyone wants to have cool swords on their emblems, right? And a sword is a basic shape. So where would you start if you wanted to create a sword? If you wanted to create a sword from nothing, what primitive shape would be the foundation? I would say a cylinder, right? And furthermore, I would start with the handle of the sword, because the handle is kind of like the biggest, the chunkiest single part. So you could create the handle and kind of build off of that. So using our basic manipulation in object mode, let's bring it up, scale it down, and let's elongate it a little bit, right? Something like that. Something like that. Make it a little bit smaller. That looks good. And don't worry too much about proportions and everything, because this is 3D. We can scale anything however we want to later on. All right. So for now, let's get rid of that backing just so it's out of the way. And let's think about how we can make this look like a handle. So if you wanted something real basic, you're already done. Like a cylinder is just the basic foundation of a handle, but we want to go a little bit more fancy with it. So let's switch over to edit mode. You can see all these faces here that make up the cylinder. Now let's use one of our tools here. Let's go back to the tools in the upper left, scroll down a little bit, and then we have this thing here called Loop, Cut, and Slide. It's a pretty useful tool. Click on it and bring it over here. It's created this purple line. Okay, if I left click, I can then slide this line wherever I want to on the shape. Now, it doesn't seem like a big deal on a perfect cylinder, but if this was like a cone or something, it's a pretty good tool to have, because you wouldn't be able to do this very easily by hand. Now, let's undo that. You'll notice by default, it's perfectly in the center, so it's a good way to subdivide something in half if you wanted to. But we'll get to subdivisions later. What I want to do, though, is I want to turn these elongated faces into multiple different faces so I can kind of make this curvy. So I loop cut, but then I scroll up to create multiple loop cuts. And I'm going to give them a lot. So let's say 36. That's a good even number. And then click. So now, if I go to faces, I've turned this cylinder into a bunch of faces. Now, how do I make it curvy? Well, what you can do is you can hold down Alt and select the face to select a ring of faces, okay? Now this is kind of weird, because if you select, it depends on what side of the face you click closer to that determines kind of the orientation of the ring. For example, if I hold down Alt and click like the bottom, I create a ring that runs vertically. If I click the side, I create a ring that runs horizontally in this particular case. Now, I've selected the top, I hold down Shift and Alt and do the same thing at the bottom. And now I've selected a ring at the top and a ring at the bottom. Now, I'm going to go down to this guy right here. And this guy is called proportional editing. Proportional editing is kind of advanced, right? And the reason we want to do proportional editing is because when we don't use proportional editing, all we're manipulating is just the very basic vertices and nothing else that we've selected. So for example, if I wanted to scale these guys down, because I want to make a taper, right? The goal is to make like kind of a rounded handle. So I want to taper these two ends. I want to make them smaller. If I just have them selected right now and I go to scale them down, look what happens. They're scaling towards a median point in the center, and they're kind of just making this really sharp edge at the top. Even if I make them bigger, it's like a hard angle change. It's really weird. Now, okay, what if I just scaled them in the X and Y plane? This is better. It's definitely tapering, but it's still a really sharp edge. That's not good. We don't like the look of that. So if we use proportional editing will actually change the actually edit the vertices in proportion to the ones we have selected, but beyond the ones we have selected. So if we do connected, and then you can change the type of proportion you want: constant, linear, sharp, root, square, smooth. I usually just keep it on smooth, but there are very good reasons to switch it if you ever find yourself in need. So now when we hit S and then Shift Z, you can see that everything is moving with it. But there is a little bit of a curve, right? How do we change that curve? Well, we use the scroll wheel, okay? You can see there's a circle here. The circle indicates the radius of how much it kind of moves out from your selection and affects the other selections. So if I make it smaller like this, I can scroll up and down to increase or decrease that area and make it sharper or smoother. So I think a good handle would look something like this. And look at that. Now we've kind of created a little bit more of a complex shape. So let's make like a bottom to this handle, right? We can select this face and we can extrude it and bring it out like this. Furthermore, maybe we could scale this up a little bit. Now remember, I have proportional editing on, but sometimes you don't want this proportional editing. So remember to switch back and forth depending on what you need. Maybe I can bring it out like this. Let's bring it down a little bit more. Oops. Let's bring it down. Something like this, and then scale it. Bring it down. And there you go. That's kind of a good handle there. But you know, that's not how most swords, right? Maybe you want like a cylinder, like turned to the side, right? I believe they're called pommels at the bottom of the swords, right? Is that right? I'm not a sword expert, not a blacksmith. Anyway, let's undo all that. So now, if you think, okay, we want like a pommel, we want to create like a different kind of geometry down here. What you could do is spawn in another basic mesh, another primitive, but you want it to come in where this circle is, where this plane is. So let's use our 3D cursor, like I kind of talked about in the first section. Let's hit Shift S and do cursor to selected. Now, if we stay in edit mode, if we stay in edit mode for a specific object and we bring in a primitive, that primitive will become part of the mesh for the object that we're editing, right? So I want to bring in a cylinder. Now the cylinder is very large, obviously. So we're going to scale it way down. Way down. Something like that. Make it a little thinner. Constrain to the Z-axis. Now we're going to rotate it. Rotate X 90 degrees. Bring it down. Make it wider because there we go. And that looks pretty good, to be honest. Something like that. That's not bad. Now, keep in mind that what we've done is we've just kind of pushed these two meshes together. We have not attached them, okay? These two meshes are different. And in fact, here's another cool way to select vertices is you can select by linking. So if I hit Control L, if I select a vertice on this cylinder and I hit Control L, it'll select all the vertices that are physically linked to that one vertice. Conversely, if I select a vertice on the little handle part, I hit Control L, it'll select all the vertices linked to that one. And so therefore, you can see that these two meshes are not connected to each other. Now, because we put them in each other, they look like they are in object mode, but they're not really in mesh mode. That has some implications, but for our purposes doing this, it really doesn't matter. We just want it to look nice, and it's only really going to come into play if you start using specific modifiers to change the mesh as a whole. Kind of like I intimated before when I was talking about the differences between scaling in object mode, scaling in edit mode. Those things might come into play. But for right now, let's just leave it like this. Doesn't really matter too much. Okay, so now we want to make like the guard, like the hand guard for it, right? What would be like the good primitive shape for that? Obviously, it's probably going to be something like a rectangle, right? Oh, we used the wrong option there. Cursor to selected. There we go. So let's create a plane. All right. Usually you could spawn in a cube and just make the cube longer, but I like to use planes whenever I do that because it kind of lets you make the extrusion a little bit easier. I don't know. It's kind of like a preference thing at that point. But anyway, let's scale along the x-axis. Bring it out a little further. That looks pretty good. Extrude the Z. All right. Now we're getting somewhere. Now, I just noticed there's some little clipping going on there, so let's make this a little bit bigger, shall we? Something like that. Okay. Anyway, back to our rectangle. Now this looks pretty good, right? But yeah, it's just a rectangle. We want it to be a little bit cooler, a little bit more detailed than just a rectangle. So let's go back to our friend Loop Cut and Slide. Make some cuts, but not nearly as much this time around. Let's do that right there. Okay. Now, what we can do is select faces. We could select these faces right here, and then scale Y and make them a little bit smaller. Now, what if we want to change this profile a little bit? Let's go back to our edges. If you hold down Alt, remember I talked about holding down Alt, and you'll select rings. Well, that applies to edges as well. So if I hold down Alt and select that, it selects a ring all the way around the outside. Hold down Shift, Alt, selects this guy. Scale in the X, I can move it like that. And there we go, we've changed the profile a little bit. You can even, if you wanted to, let's say we want to make kind of like a little point that comes out of here. So what we can do is we can select these two edges. Now hit W, and W is like your special mesh editing features. When we hit subdivide, okay, there's a bunch of tools here. Don't worry about them for now, but we'll hit subdivide. And what we've done is we just subdivided each one of those edges we selected, which naturally will create a perpendicular edge between them, okay? From here, go back to face mode, select both of these, shift, all that good stuff, extrude, and then bring them up like this. Now, if you wanted to make it kind of like a spike, right, you could do that by going back to edges, selecting these edges, G, Z, and then bringing it down like this. Okay? And there you go. Looks pretty good, right? It's definitely starting to shape up like a sword. So now we want to make the blade, okay? Now, we can actually make the blade. We don't need to create like a separate rectangle. We could, but in general, it is better if you have the ability to, if it's easy enough for you, to make all the mesh connected with itself. A lot of times you can start off like we're doing here, just kind of jamming them together, but you'll run into problems eventually. For now, I know we won't, and for a while doing your first projects, you won't, so it's fine. You can do this. In some ways, it even makes it easier. However, in general, you want to have everything be connected. So as good practice, I want to try to just make the blade out of this rectangular part that we've made here. So to do that, I want to make a little bit more area in this plane in the center, because I'm basically just gonna extrude a shape from this plane right here. But I want a little bit more area to do it. So I want to move these guys out a little bit, something like that. And I want to go back to plane, select this plane, hit W again, and this time we're gonna inset faces. The inset faces option creates a face inside a face that's already selected. And I can scale it and do everything I need to do. So what I want to do is I want to create something that's probably about that size. Obviously, we don't want the blade to be that thick. Let's make it a little thinner. Something like that. And also, we want to make it pointy, right? And that's got to be a blade. It's got to have an edge on it. So we're going to do that again. W, subdivide. And now we've created, if we go back to vertices, we've got these two vertices that are out at the edges. So if we get these guys right here, scale X, bring them in, Something like that. We want to bring these guys out. We've made a little, seems like we made a little bit of a mistake here, because I want to make this wider. All right, you can see I'm crossing over that edge, and that's no good. It's creating kind of like an error there because it's going through. So let's leave these here for now. Let's go here, here. Oop, sorry, misclicking buttons here. So we're gonna go back to edge view. I'm gonna select this ring. Ah, we can't anymore because we've inset a face. That's okay. So whenever you find the need to manually select edges along the outside of something, you can toggle this guy right here, which is kind of like your clipping. And the clipping toggle allows you to see through your object to the other side. In general, this is a good way to edit because it makes it really easy to select multiple things all at once if your hotkeys aren't working or if they're not working in the way that you want them to. And so instead of orbiting the whole way around and kind of being real awkward with the camera, you can just click through, right? It's really handy. So let's make this wider again, something like that. Now, we can go back to the vertices and make these guys real sharp. That looks pretty good. In fact, I'll make the blade a little bit wider as well. Something like that. That looks pretty good. I'm satisfied with that. So, we want to extrude this blade. So we select those two faces, hit E, bring it out. Looks pretty good, right? We're on the right track. Now, let's keep bringing this up. Let's keep bringing this up. Something about, let's say there. We don't want to make it super long because then it won't fit on our emblem correctly. Now, let's stop at this point and hit E again to bring it up a little bit further. Why am I doing that, right? The reason I'm doing that is just because if I stop the extrusion and make another extrusion, I've created a nice line right here. The reason I want to do that is because I can do things up here to these faces that won't affect these faces down here because there's an edge. If I didn't do that, and I wanted to bring this sword to a point, and I just wanted to do that by scaling these faces, it would affect the whole length of the sword, and it would look kind of dumb, right? You don't want to do that. So just as convenience, instead of having to select these and subdivide them and move the vertices, whatever, I'm just going to extrude it a little bit further as a separate section. And now whatever I do up here doesn't affect down there. Now, to bring this to a point, we could just scale that guy down a bunch, right? That doesn't look too bad, but it also doesn't look super realistic. So I want to make it a little bit more fancy than that, right? Let's go up to our friend loop cut and slide, make a bunch of little divisions. Again, let's say 32, looks pretty good. And we'll come back up here. We'll toggle off our see-through so it's easier to select things, because you know, when you have your clipping open and you have a lot of vertices, stuff can get real confusing. I could accidentally click on these guys if I don't want to. So we'll toggle it off. Now, you can probably see where we're going with this. We'll go back to proportional editing, connected, and then scale. And then we'll bring it up like that. Looks pretty good, right? It's a nice smooth transition to a point at the top. You could even go one further if you did not want to have a flat plane at the top. And indeed, when you do get close to it, there's kind of a weird like taper there. What you could do is you could hit X. Now, X, if you remember, X in object mode is just delete, and that's it. However, in edit mode, you can delete in specific ways that are really helpful. So, when you hit X, you get this little delete menu, and instead of just doing delete the vertices, delete the faces, whatever, let's do edge collapse. And then when I do the edge collapse, it puts everything into a little point right there. And then I can switch back, select that one vertice. See what happened there is I left proportional editing on. Let's take proportional editing off and bring it up like that. There you go. Nice little point. And if you notice that I'm having trouble getting the camera to work properly, if you find yourself in that same situation, remember what we did before. Shift S, cursor to selected, and then Alt Home. And now we're perfectly centered on the tip. All right? So now we've done it. We've created a sword. It looks pretty good too, right? So let's put this on our backing. So let's go over back to our outliner here. Bring the backing back by clicking on the eyeball. Then we will rotate this 90 degrees. And then, because I don't want it facing that direction, I will actually rotate it 180 degrees beyond that. So now it's facing up. Then we will bring it down like this. You can see we made it a little bit big. So let's scale it down. Something like that. That looks pretty good. Now, maybe you don't want just one sword. Maybe you want two swords. Because what's better than one sword? Obviously, the only thing better than one sword is two swords. So let's make two swords here. Let's rotate this 45 degrees, right? And let's make some cross swords. But you'll notice, if I just hit rotate, I'm not rotating around the center of the circle. I'm rotating around the origin of this object, which is not what I want. Well, how come the origin's there? The origin's there because that's where our cylinder, that's the center of our cylinder that we originally started from. But again, remember, if we don't want to rotate around that, we can move our 3D cursor and then set the pivot point to the 3D cursor. So what we'll do, excuse me, since we want to rotate around the center of the circle in this emblem, go into edit mode, face mode, select the center of the circle, or select the face, the circle face, Shift S, cursor to selected, go back out of edit mode, select the sword, and we'll go back to our top down, then go over to the pivot point, make it the 3D cursor. Now when we rotate 45 degrees, enter. There you go. Now the sword's been rotated 45 degrees. How do we make the second sword? That's really easy. Shift D to duplicate. Then with the new sword created and highlighted, it's hard to tell because it's literally in the exact same position as our original sword, but it's there. You can see the white outline. We can hit R and then 45 degrees. Now, obviously that's not right. Well, that is right. It's just not what we want. So let's hit R and then let's hit -90. Oh, man, I'm bad at geometry, aren't I? Rotate -45. There we go. That's what we wanted. So now we've got two cross swords. Pretty cool, right? But, you know, we're kind of going for a little bit of realism here, right? So let's bring, misclicking. G, Z, bring it down a little bit. They're still clipping into each other, but that's okay. From the top-down perspective, it looks pretty good. Now let's shift right-click to select both swords, G, Z, to bring them down. And let's just lay them right on top of the emblem. And there we go. That is a basic foundation for our emblem. That is part 2, guys. So that was basic mesh manipulation in edit mode. Now you have the ability to create basic shapes and with a fair amount of detail. You know, this isn't just like a cartoon sword. This definitely, anyone who looks at this will like, that's a sword, you know? So we've created our emblem. We've used some scaling and some rotating, some constraints. We've used some proportional editing. We've moved the 3D cursor around to get precise alignments on things and rotating things however we want. We've learned a lot up to this point. So, hope you had fun. I hope you learned something from this part and the first part. Please join me for the third part, which will be advanced modeling, and that will be mesh manipulation using modifiers.